For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, with the readout video from our final free Wednesday Wake Up newsletter of 2024, followed by a cold shoulder to the Canadian government, which, just in time for the holidays, issued a press release announcing a handout, bien sûr, and talking about how, quote, extreme weather events and natural disasters are a growing threat to the safety and economic stability of Canadian communities, end quote. So, is climate breakdown thingy already here? Can they point us to actual data showing that such things are increasing? Or does it just magically become true if they say it often enough? They're certainly giving it the old bureaucratic try. Environment and Climate Change Canada turned their traditional December wrap-up of wacky weather stories into dreary polemics in the 2024 edition by saying, quote, with each year, Canada sees the impacts of climate change on weather events, making many extreme weather events more likely, end quote. With each year, many events? Who writes this stuff? Especially as they then list their, quote, most impactful weather stories of 2024, end quote, and who, at least among public sector communications bureaucrats, can resist most impactful as a hook. And 3.5 of the stories involve wintry weather, from hailstones to a winter wallop to a deep freeze, all doubtless the ghastly consequence of runaway heating, and then one of them is hurricanes. And also, one is the dreaded atmospheric rivers that were once heavy rain. But evidently, bad weather is a new thing, which makes you wonder what they were babbling about in previous editions when they claimed there'd been impactful or possibly just severe storms or just weird ones before there was climate. But now, well, we're climate-scarred veterans of the rhetorical wars. Quote, from coast to coast to coast, the severe and unseasonal weather events of 2024 left a memorable mark on the lives of Canadians across the country, end quote. Once again, they seem to think that no older person ever had a story about a bad storm when they were a kid. Still, we ask whether these severe weather events are really unseasonal. We're not questioning whether hail is or is not typical summer weather. The point we're raising is that the claim seems to be that we never had storms that were remarkable, among other things, for coming at an odd time of year until Al Gore's documentary or Michael Mann's hockey stick. Oh well, we're all going to die, so we can stop worrying. At least according to the NOAA, and the media can't get enough of it, because apparently the tipping point to methane deluxe supreme has arrived in the Arctic. Specifically, quote, the region's tundra has transitioned from being a sink for carbon to a source of emissions as permafrost thaws, end quote. So, stand by for a runaway greenhouse effect. And of course, we realize that you can't predict this sort of disaster as imminent indefinitely without at some point saying that it arrived, or you're going to look pretty foolish. But if you announce that it happened, and it didn't, you're still going to look foolish. This piece is everything that you like if you like that sort of thing. For instance, it leads off with, quote, the Arctic just experienced its second hottest year on record, end quote. Which actually seems like a bit of a rip-off, since supposedly the planet as a whole is about to have had its hottest year ever. Why did the poor Arctic get left a consolation prize, especially when it's warming faster than the average? Inquiring ice floes want to know. Also, according to the story, this thawing is, of course, quote, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. That will only amplify the amount of heat-trapping gases that enter the atmosphere, paving the way for further warming, end quote. Result? Chaos and ruin all round. Quote, climate change is scrambling ecosystems and shape-shifting the landscape in the part of the planet where global warming is most intense, end quote. So, look out your window, especially the one on the north side of your house, and you may see trees singing and birds, grass growing in the sky, clouds scudding past underfoot, and rhetorical tornadoes everywhere. Because you see, quote, the Arctic is heating up far faster than places at lower altitudes, 2 to 4 times as quickly, depending on the baseline scientists use for comparison and which geography they include in assessments, end quote. Yeah, and whether they know altitude from latitude. But who fact-checks in an apocalypse? Quote, the Arctic is a fundamentally different place from what it was just 10 years ago, said the lead editor of the new NOAA report, Twyla Moon, deputy lead scientist and science communication liaison at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, end quote. A fundamentally different place. It used to be tundra, ice, and snow, and now it's snow, ice, and tundra. Shocking. And what's a science communication liaison about? Well, in the best tradition of lurid politicization of science, the NOAA offers, quote, 2024 report card headlines, end quote, something that journalists, not scientists, used to write, though now they work hand in glove to lower the reputation of both. And the first headline is, quote, "Losing Arctic carbon sinks. With wildfire and permafrost thaw, Arctic tundra is now a carbon dioxide source and remains a methane source, both heat-trapping gases," end quote. So, not to be all picky, but they didn't say it had become a methane source, they said it remained one. That shape-shifting was invented by the journalist. As for NOAA, they invented century-old Arctic temperature data to 2 decimal places. Yes, the same NOAA whose adjusted temperatures, like those of NASA, turned a thermometer-based cooling trend in the continental U.S. since the 1930s into a warming since 1895. QED. But, in rather untimely fashion, scientific alarmism weighs in on, quote, "why tipping points are the wrong way to talk about climate change. A new paper warns the concept of tipping points doesn't do much to encourage climate action from lay people and policymakers," end quote. The problem, apparently, is that if you keep announcing tipping points, but we never tip over, people start thinking you don't actually know what you're talking about. Another problem is that in the face of a crisis, real or imaginary, you can count on politicians to saunter into extravagance. Thus, we hear from the Telegraph that, quote, "Britain is to build its first full-scale carbon capture power station following almost 2 decades of delays," end quote. Not has built, you'll notice, but is to build. So the delays continue. And if you're wondering what the problem was, beyond the usual, it seems that, quote, "the decision follows 2 decades of delays by successive governments as they repeatedly tried and failed to reconcile the huge costs of the novel technology with the need for low-carbon electricity," end quote. Wait a minute. Huge costs? And here you said the green transition would save money as well as the planet, and we'd all have 3 high-tech, laid-back, copacetic jobs. Meanwhile, from NPR, we get a fearless prediction. Quote, "How many species could go extinct from climate change? It depends on how hot it gets," end quote. And no price is too high to pay for that sort of wisdom. Meanwhile, the people promoting free market climate hysteria over at the Hub on the theory that conservatives must leap aboard collapsing liberal bandwagons to prove their, well, anyway, they now denounce Canada's interprovincial trade barriers, which is correct as far as it goes, but not as far as they go. Quote, "Trade barriers are also holding back one of Canada's fastest-growing export sectors, low-carbon technologies," end quote. One of Canada's fastest-growing export sectors? If it is true mathematically speaking, it's only because they're growing from nothing to a bit, fueled by government subsidies. Mind you, they claim, quote, "the market for low-carbon technology is expected to nearly triple in size to $2.8 trillion by 2035, end quote. Yeah, expected to, by the same people who expect everything cute to die by 2050 if it gets 0.2 degrees warmer. And speaking of visionary climate economics that doesn't pan out, a powerful windstorm, Dara, demolished a solar farm in England. But there's nothing to see here. At least so says Euronews Green, under the heading, quote, "Are solar farms destroyed during storms? Experts debunk reports that panels can't handle the wind," end quote. Experts, no less. So never mind those photos of what happens when the panels can't handle the wind. Oh, and before we lapsed briefly into goodwill toward persons, the newsletter noted that Canada's Captain Carbon, our greenhouse gas hating and spewing Prime Minister, put an itinerary for December 12th saying, quote, "National Capital Region Canada, no public event scheduled. Greater Vancouver Area, British Columbia, no public event scheduled, but a very long flight scheduled." And the climate change fearing and denouncing New York Times offered, quote, "Here are 6 easy warm weather getaways," end quote. All of which, unless you personally have wings or a copious supply of pixie dust, will in fact involve traveling in a jet airplane, even if it's a more efficient one than the Prime Minister will be using to fly the 4,363 kilometers between Ottawa and Vancouver to do whatever it is that he feels like doing, but not telling us about. At least the Times is trying to save its readers money. Trudeau, not so much. In the newsletter, we also served an item that had been sitting at the back of the mental fridge shelf for a while. But when we found it there doing our annual cleaning, whether we need it or not, we couldn't resist trotting it out. It's that in its Climate Solutions Week, NPR said back in September, quote, "Eating less beef is a climate solution. Here's why that's hard for some American men," end quote. In response to which, we borrow a line from Jackie Mason. Tastes good. Arguably, at the risk of causing controversy on several fronts, better than the turkey, even at Christmas dinner. The newsletter also contained another installment of our Green Blackout series on the IPCC's efforts to bury global greening. They leave it out of their summaries on purpose and discuss it obliquely in Working Group 1, Chapter 2, focused on observed changes to the climate system. But what about Chapter 3, which focuses on human-caused changes? Here, alas, they revert to habit and can't think of anything helpful to say, except for a weirdly coded admission that it's happening. Quote, the main driver of the observed increase in the amplitude of the seasonal cycle of atmospheric CO2 is enhanced fertilization of plant growth by the increasing concentration of atmospheric CO2 medium confidence, end quote. The thing is, the seasonal cycle exists because there's more land, and therefore there are more plants in the northern hemisphere than in the southern, which means that in our winter, more plants die and release CO2, and in our summer, more plants grow and absorb it, and vice versa in theirs, or yours if you're watching from south of the equator. And so if the amplitude of the cycle gets bigger, it's because there are more plants overall. They just don't want to say it that way in case someone notices. And in case someone does notice anyway, they add, quote, there is only low confidence that this CO2 fertilization has also been the main driver of observed greening because land management is the dominating factor in some regions, end quote. So, as too often, they make use of uncertainty to dismiss inconvenient truths, but deny it when asserting dogma. In the newsletter, we also note that Greenland is cool, man, and getting cooler. According to a new analysis by a group of Thailand-based scientists led by Nitin Pongsiri of the Prince of Songkhla University, hat tip to the Friends of Science on this one, since the turn of the century, the surface of the Greenland ice cap has been cooling at a rate of about 0.055 Celsius per decade. It's a complicated picture regionally, and the trends aren't statistically significant. But when the authors say, quote, the observed ice sheet melting in Greenland within the last 2 decades could be due to other factors, end quote, than warming, we say, yeah, since there hasn't been any warming. Finally, we dug through the CO2science.org database for Christmas-themed plants and could only come up with the holly-leaved daisy bush, that's Olearia ilicifolia Hook, which is technically a member of the daisy family. But the extra CO2 boosts its photosynthesis rate anyway. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and I say, let it snow.
That's right.